video twice, but I hate videos when they are not necessarily right, even worse. I was having trouble with the internet, and then that was kind of screwing me up from a standpoint of flow. So let's do this video again. I think I started the last video with when real men can't sleep, real men do the news. So here I am doing the news at, I guess, it's 6 in the morning. Beforehand it was at 5. This is a worrying video. And this video is somewhat of a worrying trend towards, let's call it what it is. It's a third arms race, or it's another arms race. It's overt and naked at this point, an arms race. And it's an arms race that have certain economic and political realities associated with those that are intertwined with one another, and for the most part are working towards the same ends. This is the Gipper, Ronald Reagan. The Gipper, whatever you want to say about the Gipper, I love the name Gipper. That's Mike Pompeo, but it's going to cycle back to Reagan. Whatever you want to say about Reagan, he was open to de-escalation. Reagan, believe it or not, wanted to go all the way, and his advisors wouldn't allow him to go all the way, meaning getting rid of nuclear weapons. You could have did it in Reagan's lifetime. His perspective was there. He was open to it. We just never got to that reality. From a political standpoint, Republicans can pull things off that Democrats can't do. So Nixon can go to China. That's perfectly okay because Nixon is a hard man and he's a hawk, and Nixon is has a screw loose and he'll, flip out and destroy places. So he is given a certain leeway in this. Republicans are considered strong on defense. These are tough guys. They're muscular foreign policy. And so if these tough guys with the muscular foreign policy are taking these overtures to peace, then they must be doing it in a way that ensures security because they're tough guys. By the same token, Democrats can pass legislation that guts Medicare and Social Security, because ultimately they're considered, these guys are working to the benefit, just in the vague knowledge that the public has of the political space. You can go against the narrative in order to do certain things, or you can work in line with the narrative, I should say, in order to do certain things that may go against a typical narrative. In fact, it plays off pretty well together, almost like the yin and yang. In this case, the Gipper, who, yes, was trying to do Star Wars and all this other stuff, was again willing to have peace. One of the things that Reagan did right was in 1987 sign the Intermediate Missile Treaty, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. I always get the acronym wrong, but the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. This scaled down and cut down on the research and development of weapons, not to mention certain weapons, nuclear weapons, within the European theater. Meaning, they create a left. We're creating a space for dialogue. And in the space for dialogue, wins beget wins. So the fact that we've created the space for dialogue and the space between the time that we would need to respond if there was any kind of missile strike or threat, wins beget wins. The more that we make overtures for trust, the more I trust you. If you're doing something and we're scaling down in the way and the rhetoric and the language that's being used, you have this area for talking and discussion, and in some cases, cooperation. And that cooperation can beget cooperation. All of that, however, is purely determinative upon who's in that office and who and the interests the person in that office is trying to enact. It is not always the interest of the American public. Let's be very clear on this. We are not a United States. There are interests that differ vastly in this country. And I would make the point to you that this is one of those interests where they diverge significantly so from the political and from, let's say, a particular economic class. Donald Trump, whatever you want to think of him, I understand that Trump supporters put Trump in that office thinking that he was a peacenik in the race. Let's be very clear though. Peacenik is in relation to the other opponent, not an indication of a thing into itself. Donald Trump is a reality show host. His foreign policy is developed and is given to him by people who are essentially neocons. People of policy. The very fact that he put John Bolton in as security advisor should have given you some clue where Trump's head was going. Same thing with Pompeo. It should have given you a clue for where Trump's head was going. In this case, Pompeo doesn't believe, John Bolton doesn't believe in treaties. So again, this is somewhat of a worrying trend. Donald Trump has ripped up the INF treaty, essentially suspended the treaty. The United States is blaming Russia, saying Russia created these new level of hypersonic missiles, and these new hypersonic missiles somehow breaches the treaty. Russia said this is nonsense and that the United States just wants out of the treaty. Both of those things could be true. Neither of those things could be true. It's hard to know. The fact of the matter is, you can operate as if both of those things are true, and still come to something of that's a horrible idea to suspend the treaty. Fact of the matter is, no one asked the question of why Russia is developing hypersonic missiles. Is it possible they're developing hypersonic missiles because you've encircled them from the standpoint of NATO? You've broken your promises on NATO, and now you're like, how dare they create weapons to try to circumvent the fact that we're circling them in a defensive perimeter? Like this bias that always goes from the standpoint of the country itself and not necessarily taking into account the security concerns of the other nations. Nations violate treaties insofar as it goes against their own self-interest. The goal of it is to be somewhat mutually self-interest. Catching this, though, is John Bolton doesn't believe in treaties. And they're trying to use this thing that China is a part of it. That may have some factor in this, but let's be very clear on this. There is an economic and a political consensus on this idea of expanding U.S. hegemony. From the standpoint of the economic interests, expanding U.S. hegemony means expanding markets. We can sell more weapons in a world that is less safe. The more vulnerable, the more dangerous that the world is, the more people are going to be willing to arm up. And guess who they're going to buy those from? They're just going to buy those from us. Any new development in nuclear weapons is going to be money coming from the government to weapons contractors. Donald Trump's Space Force, again, is another boondoggle of sorts, where the U.S. is going to be dumping a bunch of money into private companies in order to do stuff in space. Like, this converges into somewhat of a worrying trend. I mean, if we are blowing off nuclear treaties, this, right off the bat, means that there's an arms race. That Russia and China are going to respond in kind to U.S. provocation and creation of new weapons. Meaning they are also going to create new weapons, each pointing to the other, saying, I am doing this because of the other person. And to some degree, it's partially true. In some cases, it is not. The INF, which is kind of my point, allows for a certain space. The moment that you can say, I'm doing this because of the other person, and another person can say the same, you've ended in somewhat of a finger trap. The treaty itself was a way of expanding the dialogue, expanding the amount of time it would take for something to pop off, expanding the amount of time it would take for a decision to be made in that process. Whatever you want to think of the INF or Russia and all this other stuff, this is a horrible, worrying trend. Imagine what takes place from the standpoint of technology. The United States is going to try to develop any and all weapons that they can think of. The United States has been developing tactical nukes. Now, these are nukes that are a little bit weaker than other nukes, so they can use them in the battlefield. The whole problem that the United States looked at is our weapons are so powerful that we can destroy the world. And so we can't use those weapons because we live on this world. But if we can lower the yield in the weapons themselves, the nuclear weapons, then we can get away with using nuclear weapons. This is amazing. Trust me. The moment that you start using nuclear weapons, that's a paradigm shift. How war is fought in this case is a shift. And this idea of scaling up the yield of those weapons, it's just a matter of time before it takes place. Donald Trump, and it's, led by fools and all that good stuff. Just so I make my point. Look at this. Oh, by the way, Donald Trump got elected on this idea of this kind of rage and anger, but I think a lot of that rage and anger came from economic sources, meaning 40% of the population is vulnerable or insecure, despite the number of jobs that are created. Again, the population is more poor and insecure than it has been. That creates a certain degree of something needs to change. People may blame themselves in an individual standpoint, but sometimes that anger can be directed outward at immigrants, at whatever, at Russians. In this very specific case, though, Donald Trump was elected on this. Meaning you need to do something about the economic misery that I am encountering in this country. That's what I'm electing you in this office to do. That may not get processed that way, but that rage and anger gets an outlet through Donald Trump. Trump is completely incapable of this particular task. And for all of this showmanship of saying, hey, it's the immigrants, hey, we need a border, hey, it's this, hey, it's that. At the end of the day, it comes home to you can't solve the basic crisis that is somewhat systemic of people, of the reason people elected you in that office. In an odd way, this is a shortcut that is not a shortcut at all. What I mean by this is you can trick yourself and you can fool yourself, particularly if the people who you hang around, the circles that you hang around, look at things from the vantage point of a very sliver of the population, the top 1%. And in that sliver of the population, you have people who are weapons contractors, people who develop things, build things, all that good stuff. And who say, look, the very act that you're giving more money to these people, it will trickle down into the other employees. Meaning, if you dump a ton of money by this boondoggle of Space Force, or adding weapons in space, or increasing the nuclear weapons, or adding more weapons, or selling more weapons to the rest of the world, then that will be for jobs back home, and you can get from point A to point B. It's almost like political expedience to just dump a bunch of money into a particular sector, even if that sector may end the world. Like, there's an economic reality to this that can't necessarily be ignored, that I don't necessarily think it's just them doing whatever they want. I think this is also this thing of we have certain problems that we need to solve. And in trying to solve those problems, from our ideology of things, we only have bad solutions. I could be wrong on this, but let me make my point. So this is, just to give a basic, World War III, Trump rips up treaty which could herald the return of nuclear missiles to Europe. Nuclear missiles would be stationed in Europe for the first time since the Cold War, after the United States announced it would rip up the landmark treaty. Washington, they revealed it would quit the intermediate range nuclear forces treaty a day earlier than planned, once again raising the specter of a nuclear-tipped missile deployed on European soil. The withdrawal comes just days after it emerged that the United States has begun developing low-yield tactical nukes following concerns that had existed arsenal of warheads was too big to use. The 1987 INF was designed to avert nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union by banning development, testing, and deployment of certain types of short-range, intermediate-range missiles. Again, this gives time to make decisions if something is taking place. Washington and NATO said that Russia has been flouting the treaty. Each one accuses the other. Essentially, you're doing this and the other person is doing this also. Look at this. The United States sold weapons to at least 98 countries between 2013 and 2017. The largest clients were Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Australia. The United States accounted for 34% of all exports. We only make up 5% of the population. The United States accounted for 30% of all exports, and its exports increased by 25% compared to 2008 to 2012. There is a financial interest involved in this. It's almost as if both sides get what they want. The people like Bolton gets a certain amount of hegemony around the world, while the weapons contractors grinning ear to ear, not caring about the consequences in a larger world sense, but caring about it only in a narrow economic sense that they themselves will benefit from these weapons being sold all over the place, and new development on new weapons will be used. I'm saying this is not indicative of something that is in the best interest of the country, or for that matter, even the planet. This is a small body of people that seek to profit, either through this kind of political hegemony of believing the United States should be the one iron fist across the planet, and seeks to inflict that through various military campaigns across the world. These are people like Bolton and Pompeo. And there may not necessarily be a direct economic interest to them in this. Like I said, this is somewhat political ideology at work. Whereas there is an economic reality to some who decide that they want to kind of take them up on this offer. If you want to sell weapons, hey, I'll sell you weapons. It's like if you're a dealer. If you want to sell coke, hey, I'll offer you coke. If you want to snort, I'll offer you. It's that type of stuff. It's like it may not necessarily be the entire reasoning that the person is using, but there are people who are willing to take advantage of the fact of the outcome to that. Here's another thing. I found this one to be amazing. America's largest business lobby is hailing the Trump administration's plan to boost American weapons exports. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Defense, and Aerospace Export Council welcomes the State Department's announcement regarding the approved implementation plan for the Conventional Arms Transfer Policy. Council President Keith Weber said in a statement on Friday. The U.S. State Department this week announced its plan to process to implement the Conventional Arms Transfer Policy, which adds economic security as a factor when the government considers whether to approve arm exports. It intends for the executive branch to advocate strongly on behalf of companies exporting defense items. Why? Why are you doing that? It sounds like you would do that if you think that those will create jobs back home. That the money that we're dumping into that stuff, to some degree, props up. It's almost like they're juicing up the industry by making the world more insecure. Don't believe me. It says it right here. This is defensenews.com. It's not bullshitting. It makes all the sense in the world. When Donald Trump is going to Europe and he's telling him, you know, you need to spend more money on weapons. You need to spend more money on weapons. Where do you think they're going to get those weapons from? Us. They're going to get those from us. He's not saying that for, you know, all these Trump supporters were like, yeah, Donald Trump, you tell those guys, you know, in Europe, fuck them. He's not doing it for you. He's not doing it for you. Here's another thing. One of the lasting legacies of the Trump administration could be the creation of Space Force. We're going to have Space Force. The sixth branch of the military to defend the United States' interests in space. We're going to be fighting aliens, baby. Vice President Mike Pence on Thursday, August 9th, speaking to the Pentagon, laid out the administration's plan to combat what it says has been an aggressive move by rivals towards militarizing space. Oh, we're just so behind on all this stuff. We're so behind on all of this. For many years, nations from Russia to China to North Korea and Iran have pursued weapons to jam, bind, and disable our navigation and communication satellites via electronic attacks from the ground, Pence said. I love this! God, I love this, that you can say stuff like this. Why are they doing that? Our systems that we use to pound the fuck out of the enemy, they're trying to jam those things. They're trying to stop us from being able to use those weapon systems against them. Those bastards. So we need to develop new weapon systems that we can use against them. In which case, they're going to say, well, look, the United States is creating weapon systems, so we need to create new weapon systems. This creates this kind of Chinese finger trap. And I don't say that to be racist, I'm just saying that's what it's called. It's a finger trap. You get yourself into it, and then you need to find your way to extricate yourself, because all of the incentives at that point is almost like a tornado. The energy fuels itself. This person does this person responds, you end up with one countermeasure after the next. What do you honestly think takes place if the United States drops a tactical nuke anywhere around the world? Be honest. What do you think is going to take place? Do you believe that other countries are not going to develop tactical nukes? Do you believe that they're incapable of developing tactical nukes? Let alone, do you think that the use of tactical nukes will remain at the use of tactical nukes? You've broken the egg of sorts. And in this case, you've allowed this kind of nuclear genie on the planet where this is considered just to be a normal course of war. This is a worrying turn. Imagine weapons platforms that float just in the atmosphere. And when there's an attack that needs to be made, they can drop a ballistic bomb that's not nuclear at all, but the force in which it hits the ground hits it with somewhat of a nuclear force. I'm trying to get across to you the world that we're creating here. Do you honestly want all of these various countries putting weapons in space, these things that can annihilate a population? And what do you think those weapons are going to be? Are they going to be laser weapons? Are they going to be microwaves? And do you realize even with that, crowd control, like putting something in space that has a capacity to kill, what if it doesn't just kill? What if it has a capacity to pacify? This is a worrying turn in regards to our relations with the rest of the world. This will not end well, at least if it continues the way it is. The president will request that Congress set aside $8 billion over the next 5 years to fund the creation of the Department of Space Force. Do you believe that they're going to put that money? They're going to put that money into private hands. It's just going to be going to a bunch of private corporations. All of this money on weapons to kill and maim. And in addition to weapons to kill and maim, now we've pulled the Band-Aid off. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, all of these countries have no incentive at all to not develop, nor do they have an incentive to believe that the United States will uphold its treaty obligations, even if it did sign a treaty on this, seeing as Trump administration was willing to blow off whatever treaty it didn't necessarily want to pay attention to. Just saying. I'm going to end this here because I don't want this video to be too long, but this is a worrying trend. This is a very worrying trend. I'll end this here. If you guys enjoy the content, please consider sharing, liking. You can always support the PayPal or Patreon. I think so. Oh, 21 minutes. That's brutal. That's way too long. Anyway, I think my point is clear.